I'm Loki Karuna, and this is TRILLOQUY. Thanks for joining me once again. It's sort of an ominous sounding theme for this season, but there's something about that out of tune low note that I just love. Shout out again to Soggy Beats for creating that really cool theme. Before I jump into this week's opus, I want to give a shout out to our friends over at the Gateways Music Festival. They have some big stuff coming up in late April, unfolding at the Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York, and across New York City, including at the iconic Carnegie Hall. The Gateways Spring Festival 2025 invites audiences through a tapestry of intimate recitals, bold new works, thought-provoking discussions, and inspiring educational initiatives crowned by the Gateways Festival Orchestra, composed of Black professional musicians from the nation's leading orchestras and music faculties. And they all perform under the baton of Maestro Anthony Parnther. Shout out to Anthony. I think I've talked to y'all about Anthony before, but just as a quick aside, when I moved to Los Angeles in 2010 to get a master's degree at USC, I wasn't there for long before my teacher said, "Oh, this guy named Anthony gave me his contact information. You should reach out to him." Fast forward, I'm playing with the Southeast Symphony that he I don't know if he still conducts it, but playing with the Black Orchestra out there, being connected to all sorts of opportunities. So shout out to Anthony Parnther and everyone over at the Gateways Music Festival. You can learn more about the 2025 festival and all of the events on the website gatewaysmusicfestival.org. Definitely looking forward to all of those performances and events. I'm also thrilled to announce season 2 of Gateways Radio. I'm honored to host another 13-part series highlighting the Gateways Festival performances and other works that celebrate so-called classical music as it intersects with the African diaspora. And I'll share more on Gateways Radio in the coming weeks. I need to get that wrapped up, but that's also coming. So big stuff, huge stuff from the world of Gateways. So the idea of relevance has been coming up with folks that I work with on the ground. So I'm going to share some thoughts on that in today's TRILLOQUY. But first, I just want to introduce you to today's guest. Is Maestro Sean Mayes. Sean is a New York and Toronto-based music director, conductor, educator, and academic whose work has involved productions across the United States and Canada and even in the United Kingdom. His work spans the range of numerous musical styles between Broadway, theater, opera, classical, and pops. And recently, he led a performance by the newly formed Pops of Color Orchestra in a production of The Voice of Whitney. Yes, that Whitney. In our chat, we cover Sean's trajectory as an artist and as a conductor, his general views on concert programming and relevance. There's that word again. And we, of course, cover what it was like showcasing the work of Whitney Houston in an orchestral setting. Huge thanks to Cindy Byram and her PR team for setting this up. And shout out to Sean for taking the time to chat with me. To get us there, who else's music could I possibly share with you other than Whitney Houston's? I remember this opening music being played on a marimba, but to my ear right now, it sounds more like a kalimba. But either way, it's one of the many incredible and one of the most iconic musical moments given to us by the late Whitney Houston. So I hope you enjoy this look back at one of the instrumentals from her catalog and hope that you enjoy my chat with Maestro Sean Mayes.
Growing up in Canada, the question isn't, the question surrounding your blackness or your identity as, being black is, it's more like, well, what island are you from? What island is your family from? Right. And so my whole life growing up, I always found that interesting because that was the first question that, of course I'd get asked. And that is truly the default, of course, right? Because of the history of our country in Canada and in terms of island population and migration and of course, our connection to colonialism, et cetera, right? So I was always like, oh yeah, actually, my pops is from America, right? So we're like legit African American, right?
Mhm.
In that regard, which was always so interesting because for so many people, that's obviously just not the case in Canada, right? In terms of being black, most of our black population are from an island, right? Or have those ties to the migration from an island. So it was always interesting to as I say, I mean, between both Drake and Kendrick, I have my own my own thoughts on, again, who beat out who, but it's fascinating to have those sorts of thoughts and explorations as to like what it means to be, quote unquote black on both sides of the border, right? And hearing Canadian, telling Canadians it's like you're African American, right? And I think that even that sometimes people are like, oh, they have less of a way of kind of identifying that or knowing what to do with that because it's just not kind of a, obviously, I mean, knowing that your neighbors are African American if they're black from the States, but like not knowing totally what to do with that construct. So it's an interesting question for sure.
What's your perspective on how folks on the ground in Toronto are engaging the Drake Kendrick thing? Are Canadians holding the Canadian front, or
I would like to. I think so. I mean, I don't know if I hold the front on the Canadian side of that as much as I'm like, listen, I mean, one of these two has a Pulitzer and one doesn't, right? I'm like, for me, I think it's pretty clear, right? But I definitely, yeah, I would definitely say that there is, at least from my friends in terms of my circles and stuff, I would definitely say that there's an inclination for Canadians to be like, yeah, but like he's our national one, right? He's our hero too.
yeah.
So, and it's interesting to see, I mean, the funny thing is that conversation is happening not just on this front but on so many fronts these days, right? Like, we are fully engaged as Canadians across all stripes as to in the conversation of what it means to be a Canadian right now, what it means to have national pride.
Mhm.
When we have, unfortunately, a leader from the South that's kind of mocking and attacking that and sort of utilizing that as a way of being like, you're trying to tell us that our identity as Canadians is only defined by how much we identify against America, right? Which is just, I mean, we could have a whole other hour conversation on
Oh, indeed.
on, on that alone, right? But so yeah, so it's an interesting parallel as well at the same time.
And I want to pull on that thread of just the word American, working with,
Yeah.
organizations like the American Composers Forum, American Composers Orchestra. We're always trying to affirm that when we use that word America, we're talking about folks from the tip of Chile all the way to
Yes.
whatever's at the
Yes.
top of Canada. I need to go back to my geography lessons, but
Yeah.
on,
Yeah.
on the same hand, even being on the ground in Canada myself, I had to kind of, get used to people saying the word America in reference to the United States. It's for us,
Yes.
it's all about being inclusive. Considering your, the border hopping nature of your career, I wonder if that's also a conversation that you've engaged, just the connotation around the word America as it relates to equity and those sorts of things.
1,000%. I mean, it's so important, right? I think it's really important for us to consider, and especially as you mentioned, right, in the context of just thinking about inclusivity and what how the Americas,
Mhm.
right, and thinking about what does that hold, like what connotation does that word hold, Americas versus American, right, or America,
Mhm.
and thinking about this sort of broader encompass and approach, and especially when we talk about music, right, because I think there is yeah, I think there's something lost, to be honest, if we don't embrace this. I mean, we can talk about that even as far as black music goes, right? Like if we're getting that specific, right? Thinking about, obviously, we know what the history of like African American music is, what this and how that has happened from within the U.S., within the continental U.S.
Mhm.
But it only takes going back like 200 years, and you're already having to unpack what the definition of American music is by what the definition of the Americas are, right? You know, you're thinking about even just those migrational patterns and thinking about, you know, the Americas, but also like this transnational interplay of movement of art, of music and artists, and you know, and certainly as far as Black music and the roots, obviously, I mean, obviously from Africa, but like thinking about how those patterns move from there to the islands to Europe to, you know, back to America and Canada and all the Americas, right? So I think there's definitely something to be said about trying to keep that word encompassing, and also just for us as like, you know, I think particularly as like North Americans, and I think particularly as like United States and Canada, right? If we're thinking about sort of Kendrick and Drake, right? It's like we should be embracing and thinking about the things that are you know, similar in terms of our art making and our creation, and the topics that we can be addressing in our art and our music that are similar and not dissimilar. And certainly, you know, there's major cultural differences. There's no question. I'm not arguing that, but it is. I think we're stronger as you know, even just on like an industry level when we kind of embrace that a bit more fully. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's really my ultimate goal, or one of my ultimate visions, is here on this side of the world for us to really interrogate the way that we think about classical music. I mean, if I say the phrase Indian classical, there isn't a lot of argument about what I'm referring to. If I
Yeah.
say the phrase American classical, what is it for you? How would you define that?
You know, it's so interesting. I have to think back to, I mean, you know, I was like, my training was like conservatory, right? So it was, you know, we did, you know, you're talking about American classical music, and obviously through a conservatory program, there's a very specific identification of what that is, right? You know, people are
Copeland,
like, oh,
Rainy Beach.
yeah, Charles Ives and blah, 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 right? But it is so fascinating that if we think about classic and classical, right? How that term has just been, yeah, I mean, you know, you think you think about the history of any part of what would sort of be defined as this, you know, again, and I hate even using this word in the context of the conversation we're talking about, but like the tradition, quote unquote, traditional definition of what American classical music has been defined as, which is, you know, truly kind of what the old white guys were doing, right? It's very interesting to compare that and be like, I mean, look, even I mean, we know what it is. Even like Dvorak was like, you know, taking stuff and being like, oh, this is it, right? Like,
And
so
we still haven't
so
listened to him.
and it's like, you know, so there's so much in terms of the history that has been, you know, I mean, you can trace all. I really do think, and I've said this to people, you know, I say this all the time. I really do maintain that, you know, I mean, you know, so I mean, most forms of American music are traced back to, obviously, to Black music, right, and Black forms, and we know that, and then that's not even unpacking again, like, you know, indigenous histories in the country too, and how and what has you know miraculously lasted from those histories as well too, right? So but yeah, I mean, I think that it's a big question. It's the question, right? I mean, for us as musicians and artists, and I think about it all the time too, right? Like you know, I came up again, like you know, I studied classical organ, classical voice. I did conservatory. I was, you know, play piano. You know, I that is my rep. I know that stuff, right? But you know, and I think, and obviously the assumption for a lot of people, especially because I work so much now in like popular music, and that was that they're like, oh well, you know, you're an artist of color. You know, you were definitely a jazzer. Like, you went through a jazz program. I was like, I mean, like, no, my memorization is like, you know, Brahms and Buxtehude and César Franck, and you know, and Bach, right, as far as organ is concerned, and then, you know, so, but at the same time, you know, like, whereas I would dance around the living room when I was like 5 or 6 with, my pops, who was, my dad, who was in the music business, was, came up through Buffalo, played with cats like Rick James,
Mm.
and released albums like that. So him and I could sing, by memory, and I still have it, like full length Beethoven symphony movements. Um, I was listening to like, obscure B-sides, and can sing you every Temptation song that's ever been written, right? By every member individually, not just, like, and Eddie Kendricks, and, David Ruffin, and et cetera, right? So there was always this sort of mixture of like, okay, how does how do what is quote unquote classic, what is classical, and thinking about, you know now that I am so, I moved through all those years of kind of being in that sphere, and then now being, with the work I do orchestrally, and thinking about what an orchestra's doing, and, what does it mean to be doing music at this level, and mostly just for like access. Like, I'm just like, it's so wild to think about how we are going to define that moving into a new generation, and a new, yeah, I mean, just that, a new generation of people who are going to be coming to the symphony hall and listening to music, and what does it mean that we can, legit, like, how can we provide that legitimization to every form and style that has always been in the mix? How can I have people come and hear a Beethoven symphony right next to, to Temptations arrangements and orchestrations, and have them find the value and the history, frankly, in both? Because if we do, like, if we do a concert and we do Charles Ives, or we do the Temptations, like, there are, or we do like early blues, or so, there are, we're painting a picture that was being, sketched at the same time in
Hmm.
in America. You know what I'm saying? So there's, so that is also a fascinating thing, is that, like, as much as we want to kind of silo these things apart from one another, these were happening literally state by state, like next to each other, and like up the road from each other, right? So yeah, I think about it all the time, and I think it's actually a big part of the work that I am really proud and happy to do, is that, I love the work that I do in being a conductor, and a writer, and trying to think about how do we, how do we break down the silos of all of that. I remember working on my opera that went up at the Canadian Opera Company last year, and having a conversation with, with some of the higher ups about it, and they were like, well, and talking about like the orchestration and what was involved and stuff, and, we had very specific asks for it, because there were, things that there was instrumentation that we were like, this is just going to lend itself to what this is, because it's Black music, right? So it's like, yeah, we can have a bass guitar next to an oboist, and, and find a world where that melds together. But the comment sometimes would be like, well, we don't want this to sound like a Broadway musical. And it's like, okay, so how do we unpack that, right? Like, where there's already this identification of like, but in this form we do this, and we don't amplify, or we don't do this, and it's like, but who and what are we leaving at the door, because we're not thinking about embracing those things, right? It's really, really interesting stuff, for sure.
I mean, and when you talk about this idea of legitimizing these different forms, we're going to talk about the voice of Whitney, that
Yeah.
led. Whitney Houston doesn't need to be legitimized by anyone. The Temptations don't need to be legitimized. So it feels like there's a sort of artistic totem pole or power dynamic that we're actually talking about, and not really the
Yes.
music itself.
It's literally exactly that. And the irony is that, even though we, like, people might say those things in the same breath of being like, yeah, but this is Beethoven and this is Whitney Houston. I'm like, don't pretend like y'all aren't listening to both of them.
Right.
And don't pretend like you don't love Whitney for the reasons that you love Whitney, right? Like, like real talk, right? So it's very, yeah, it's just so interesting, and I think that there's so much work to do, but I think the ultimate thing is that we have no choice, right? And I found, as we were like, I'm curious. I know you had mentioned. I was very curious by your opinion. Just talking about like the idea of the symphony or the orchestra existing long term over like other forms such as like Broadway, and I'm very curious to unpack that with you, right? Because it's kind of looking at these institutions next to one another and being like, which ones can grow, which ones can change and morph and expand, right? To enable a future in them, right? That's a very, very interesting. It's something that's always on the forefront of my mind as an artist, for sure.
I mean, because when we think about legitimizing art forms on a Friday night, if I don't have anything to do, I can usually bet on getting some seat at the New York Philharmonic. I
Yeah,
can't just walk up and get a ticket to Lion King, whenever I want. That's just the
that's that's real. Yeah, that's very fair. That's very true.
I know a lot of music directors who, have their own orchestras across the United States and are really doing their thing, but so many of them think of being a Broadway conductor as really the thing that would be incredible to do. And you've managed to get to do that work. I wonder what was your pathway? Was it the same conservatory training that just happened to lead to Broadway, or are there other things that happened along the way?
It's interesting. I think one of the most fascinating things I've found in my journey has been learning that there is no one path to being a Broadway music director, a conductor. And I've actually been really amazed at how different the pathway can be, right? And I think about I always use the example of another dear friend and colleague, a brother in our business, Alvin Hoff, who's he's the associate conductor over at Lion King in New York now, and just doing incredible things over there as one of the first Black conductors on the show, especially to be doing that work in New York, which is so important, right? As sort of this cultural hub of the show and operating in New York, right, where all of this happens. But his degree is in meteorology,
Oh,
right?
wow.
He was a Harvard guy, but again, has been playing piano since he was 3, which was not my journey into it. I started very late, right? I started, I got into a performing arts high school here in Toronto, and I was like, oh, this is great. But I thought, I was like, oh, I'm going to be an actor, right? Which is hilarious to think back on now, right? And then went into it, and then realized that, soon after that, music, but more specifically, music education was my love, was what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And I've come face to face with it more directly for better, for in some ways than others. Like I was in the classroom. I taught in classrooms for years, in Canada and overseas, and did a lot of work as a teaching artist, et cetera, et cetera. So I've seen every angle of arts education, right? But I'd always enjoyed conducting, and particularly kind of from the teaching angle. You can sort of use that as a way to shape and inform and help to inspire, really, right? Was I think was what I was always amazed by, because I was so inspired by my mentors, right? When I was growing up. And sort of one thing led to another. And yeah, I mean, New York is it's a big small family for sure. So, I moved to New York with a job with Disney Theatricals specifically, but as a teaching artist, music director. So we used to work on all of the Disney, young people's content, right? Like, so any of the junior shows we worked on, helped to develop. We would teach workshops in schools and to adult groups and visitors, and we used to lead things. One of my favorite things was, I used to lead the djembe circle every year at Lion King for Kids Night on Broadway, which is this big special night where every person, anyone who pays for a ticket gets to bring someone under the age of 18 for free. And it's always a big night because naturally it's a free ticket, right, for young people. So you get all sorts of people coming to the theater, which is really cool. and then it was sort of just a combo because of that and the conducting and those skills. And I'd always loved being active in theater. I think theater music is still, it's one of the coolest forms we have in terms of, even when you do the same show over and over again, people sometimes ask if that replication gets a little bit tiresome sometimes. And I personally don't find that to be the case. I find it really, really great to be able to have numerous attempts to continue to do something again and to find that energy and to refine. And every show is different, right? So I love it for that. But yeah, it was sort of a wild path. And then, one thing led to another, and was doing the thing on Broadway, and very, very fortunate to kind of be in those circles, and here we are, right?
At this stage of your career, what do you look back and consider your first big podium gig? And what was it like? What were the nerves like? Well, I wonder if you can paint that picture.
That's a great question. I mean, I some of the moments for sure when because every the path is usually like, it's like you start small and get bigger. So, so I had my share of like off Broadway gigs and stuff like that. And I mean, even just thinking to some of those before I like hit Broadway was so fascinating to see the thing operating at a smaller scale. But it was really, it was a lot, right? And I'm glad that I've gotten to a point in my career and my journey as an artist and as a musician where I now embrace the idea of being able to make music for enjoyment's sake when I'm on a podium and not just for music's sake. Because I think that's the thing we miss so often is so much, right? And like, I used to I remember having this conversation with my organ teacher. Um, and for years as I was working as an education major, I was doing the thing playing, and and he was, I mean, rightly so, right? I don't regret that he was tough, but he was tough, right? He was like, you gotta lean in and play and practice. And he wasn't wrong because I was so far behind. I had started playing in high school. I started playing piano. I had never played until that point. So I really kind of over the course of 4 years just forced myself to get enough piano training to be able to go get into a music program. And I did, and I was lucky, but it did mean that I was really behind. I had a lot of work to do. And so for years he used to tell me, he's like, you're much weaker than the other students, et cetera, et cetera. And then by the time, years later, he was like, my only regret was that you weren't a performance major. And I was like, what? Where? I was like, where was this all this time? And I think what it put into perspective for me was, oh, like if I had just thought about like making music for enjoying music and not just thinking about having to get the notes right on a page, which is gonna happen, right? Like that's why we practice and that's why we do all the technical stuff. But I was like, if we, I was like, I like you got to make music, you got to enjoy making art, um and let go of the notion that like art should be or is going to be perfect. And I know it sounds so cliche, but it's like I've done, especially like now having been on Broadway stages and different symphony stages, I'm like, if I get lost in the idea of like missing a beat in my pattern, or or like playing a one little wrong note, which is all it's going to be at this stage, like I'm toast, right? I'll never, not only can I not inspire myself, but I can't inspire the people in front of me to also just have a good time, because it is, and it goes back to teaching, right? It's like, you only get your best as a leader out of people when, I believe, when they feel safe and they feel able to kind of just like breathe a sigh of relief and be like, okay, cool. Like I'm just here to do something as opposed to be, that's I never got that sort of persona that some conductors have where they're like, it's like like you don't like where people where you're like you act as if you don't put your pants on one leg at a time, right? And I'm just like that doesn't make any sense, right? It doesn't make what we do inclusive, or it doesn't make it feel it like people can openly embrace it. And I try and take that approach to all my work. When I conduct on the podium, often even if we have children in the audience and stuff, at Lion King, I'm like, come up and ask questions and take a look and see what you see, right? Because it starts there, right? And that's yeah, we all need to be lifelong dreamers and be inspired, right? And that only happens if it feels like stuff is accessible to us. So I try to be that sort of leader on the podium, and yeah, it's interesting.
When you talk about accessibility, I can't help but to think about your recent performances of the symphonic celebration of Whitney. I mean, that is something that is so accessible. We all know the music, but it wasn't just a celebration of Whitney Houston. I understand this was also the debut of the Pops of Color Orchestra. Um,
That's right.
there's so many questions that I could ask, but I just wonder if you'll talk about why the focus on pops of color, especially considering all of the critiques that quote unquote DEI these days.
Yeah, well, and especially, I mean, well, thanks for asking, Loki. And yeah, it was, I mean, so you know, I had really, the idea for Pops of Color had come up kind of twofold. One was sort of back to this journey of education that I spoke about previously. And it was from the work I was doing in New York City schools, and I was going out into schools and working directly with students, and I would go out with pops programs, and they would send me out into schools, and then I'd get there and the students are like, Mr. Sean, da da da. And I realized, I was like, oh man, these students really love they really love this time together. But I realized after a while that it wasn't really even about like anything specific that I was doing in terms of like my lessons, or it was really that a lot of these students in all corners of the city of New York, they were like, oh, we have somebody in front of us who actually like looks like us, who's like inspiring us to do this, to care about this, right? And that it's fun. And so, I kind of sat on that for a while and was like, okay, well, what do we do here? And then I would see how just it's kind of meeting a need, right? I think it's we talk so much about like diversity in our orchestras and in our art, and who's getting access to the work and the jobs that are that are representing the music that we listen to and that we enjoy. And so I was, when I, as an arranger, as an orchestrator, I was working in these circles, and I'm like, man, for music that focuses on like popular artists, we're really not fully embracing the true canon of the Americas,
Mhm.
right? We're really not embracing that, because I'm like, we can have galas about like Stephen Schwartz and Alan Menken, and that is important, and that needs to be done too. But Quincy Jones has written every popular song that everybody has known, black or white or anything, on for the last 70 plus years, right? So that was sort of the turning point for me. And I just kind of said, I was like, what if we had an ensemble that just literally flipped this entire paradigm on its head? And what if we had galas with this ensemble? And what if we honored our cultural icons? And what if we invited those students to come in from all corners of New York City schools to come and see their the same icons be represented and honored on a stage? Because chances are, if those students are coming, they probably know that music because it's part of their cultural identity. Their parents probably know that music because it's part of their identity. And so we were really lucky with just even this past week with the Voice of Whitney to be able to do that, we went to visit four New York. We visited three New York City schools and one school in New Jersey, which was actually the Whitney Houston Academy.
Wow.
And we got the opportunity to do just that. We went out and we went into these schools and we talked about who Whitney was. And the wild thing was, for most of these students, the students we had at the Whitney Academy out in East Orange, they are in grade six. We have about 50 grade six students. And there, which means that they were born in like 2012, 2013.
Wow. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, which was the year, which 2012 was the year she passed, right? So we're literally now on the edge of this. The moment is now, right? Like if we're going to maintain and preserve the legacy of these people, of these artists who've done so much, who've left us so much, especially in Whitney's case and in so many others who aren't with us. We got to get busy now. And that was what I really, I will say with all due respect and thanks to, the producing companies, so obviously Sony and Primary Wave, who gave their yes for the Whitney project to be produced, but Park Avenue artists who produced in the city, and then of course, the collaboration that we are now able to do with Town Hall, with the orchestra, with Pops of Color. I mean, for we searched for a long time with Pops of Color to find a hall that really represented, what our mission and our mandate was, which was to, just to be able to really, really bring these figures into the forefront. And the town hall on 43rd Street, I think arguably in that area of our city of New York, is I think it's the strongest example culturally we have at that particular spot in the city, where it's surrounded by dozens of Broadway theaters, but
Mhm.
this was also a stage where Marian Anderson and Paul Robeson and countless figures, historical artistic figures, got their first step on a stage when no other stage and no other institution would even give them the time of day.
Mm.
And then once they did that, Carnegie Hall, et cetera, all the other institutions, they got wise, right? They're like, oh, damn, like, okay, maybe we need to actually embrace this person as well, right? And so it was a launch pad for so many artists, so many people, right? Not just American, we're talking about Americas, right? This opera I wrote last year for the Canadian Opera Company about Portia White, who was the first, kind of first celebrated black Canadian concert singer, contralto. She got her start at Town Hall, and it launched her international career when Canadian stages and institutions wouldn't even take her seriously. And she went to travel the world after that, right? She was like, bye. Like, so it really, it's fascinating, but I'm really, really, I'm really grateful that now it's been birthed, and now that we had a lovely time, and it was most importantly just a great celebration of Whitney's legacy and her life, and the life of a person who left us with so much. And for Sony and Primary Wave and Park Avenue and et cetera, as I mentioned, in terms of the producing partners, I really we need people to step into that realm to be like, okay, we're going to honor via this form of music, the orchestra, the symphony, which is so important. We're going to honor these figures, and we're going to give them an orchestral platform to be heard on, right? And so as an arranger, as an orchestrator, I was like, this is nuts. I'm literally sitting here listening to in studio, listening to her vocals and listening to the nuances of all of these tracks I've listened to my entire life. But now I get to, similar to me dancing around the living room with my pops, I get to like figure out the best place for a bassoon to go into that, right? And so I just there's so much work that can be done to, again, when we're talking about access and think about what that does for a young person in our city in New York, across the country, across the Americas, right? If we if we utilize that power to be like, yeah, you can rock out on bassoon too, or you can, and not even rock out in the most direct sense of the word, but you can live a full life doing your thing, and these are all of the people that, and the music that can represent as well. It's I mean, I don't have to tell you about how powerful that is, present company with that, with, on the bassoon and et cetera, as one example, but but it's really cool.
But when you talk about these kids who were born in 2012, 2013, I can't help but to think about not only the importance of sharing these Black histories through music, but
Yeah.
the narratives that are created specifically. So, I mean, when it comes to Whitney Houston specifically, there's
Yeah.
I Want to Dance with Somebody, Whitney. There's,
Yeah.
We Got Something in Common, Whitney, and all the music that
Yeah.
she made with Bobby Brown.
Yeah.
There's It's Not Right, but It's Okay, Whitney, which is very
Yeah.
different. There's The
Yeah.
Preacher's Wife, Whitney. All of that to say, how did you
Yeah.
engage the creation of the narrative for these kids who just don't have the context to fully understand the depth and the breadth of her work?
It is some of it definitely you realize is a little bit more subconscious, and certainly for younger listeners, because yeah, they didn't have trying to emphasize that to especially a younger audience. It's so interesting doing that now that she's essentially a piece of history now, right? We've arrived at that point, and but like for the audience, for us listening, it was like one of my favorite moments in the concert was It's Not Right, but It's Okay. The start of it in the Whitney concert specifically is it's a huge marimba. It's like a
Of course, yeah.
four mallet marimba solo, right? So it's like, here you go, three and dunk 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 dunk, and you add like the way people were screaming. Like I tell you, like people are like, oh, okay, like going off in the audience, and I I just it was so there was so much joy. There's so much joy, and like to feel people singing along with different stages of their life and dancing through different phases of their life,
Yes.
right? It just there is, I mean, it's history, but there's so much man, that's it's really, really healing stuff we can do, especially with figures who I mean, like raised us really, like, and I think that was one of the interesting things with the concert too, is that there's the concept of it really is like it's her voice, right? So we're on click track in the orchestra, and we conduct, I conduct to her, and so it is like we're accompanying her, but it is so fascinating, just like the concert, I think, does a really, really great job, even just dramaturgically, of like walking us through the full length of her life, of her career especially. And it really, I think, did a great job of reminding us that that she raised us, that she brought us up. And that's a really powerful and important thing when we are considering our role in the maintenance and preservation of art, not only when it's like past, but like when it's in front of us. You know what I mean? I mean, we all witnessed that journey that she went through,
Yep.
right? And that was at our cost, right? Because it really, again, like the creation of that level of art and that accessibility of art, and to be that open, to have a soul that is that open as you walk this earth, for people literally around the world to be able to access and take a piece of you, like that's really, really, really big stuff. It's really heavy stuff. And so I think one of the most powerful things that the audience actually left with was, I believe, and I really felt it, and people have said this since, is just the sense of seeing the life of somebody who was so incredible, but truly gave so much, gave of herself so much, gave such a big gift, and our responsibility in thinking about how do we not squander that, both now that, for in Whitney's case, now that she's gone, but thinking about the future, and how do we create community and art that's healthy, and that is, that is able to have this symbiotic effect where, we can give as much back to those people and not just take, right? And we'll all be better for it, right? Because the art that will happen as a result will be that much more meaningful,
I understand that there are future performances of this musical planned. How can folks learn about those and see if they can get tickets?
And so talking about Whitney specifically, or Pops of Color, or I guess
Whitney
both, maybe.
specific. Oh, maybe both. Yeah.
Or both, yeah. Well, Whitney has already got. We're going down to Nashville with it in June, at the end of June. So we're excited about that. So that's on the calendar. That's at the end of, I believe that's let me double check my calendar. That's the 25th of June currently. So it's a Wednesday night in Nashville for all the Whitney fans who have Whitney will travel. So that's going down. The easiest one too, and we're looking for opportunities to bring it literally all around the world. So, definitely keeping up with the estate and Whitney's accounts, and that, that all gets shared as well. And then, yeah, the same thing for Pops of Color. We've already got some cool projects on the horizon, as far as in terms of our programming at Town Hall, and at this rate, it looks like we will definitely be rocking something out every couple of months, which is really, really great. So, I would encourage folks to, follow us online, Pops of Color Music, as far as, on Instagram, and popsofcolor.org, for our website, which has a mailing list they can log into, Town Hall as well, of course, keeping up with and I think, like, knowing what's going on at Town Hall, yeah, irregardless, is a great and powerful thing. They have so much incredible programming. They're doing stuff every other day, true, literally. And so it's a great, 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 great cultural institution, especially if you don't know that much about it. I would really encourage, any listeners, if you don't know about the Town Hall, check it out. They've got an awesome spot on their website where they kind of walk through the entire history of the hall, and this cool sort of interactive, like, online page that they have on their site. But you can from there check out their they have concerts, they have it's really, really cool stuff they're doing there.
And beyond Pops of Color and the Whitney musical, how can folks learn more about you and keep up with your other projects, both in New York, Toronto, and beyond?
Oh boy. Well, I got to admit, I'm not the best at socials. I do my best, but I'm a big believer that if you're keeping busy, it's that's that's the biggest mark of all. But I am online. I do my best to try and keep things up on mostly Instagram these days. So I'm online at Maestro Mayes, Mayes. So that's my handle, I have a website as well, SeanMaysMusic.com, that gets updated periodically, or if people are interested, or, I'm always open to, I love when people reach out. I love, when people, that's why I try and put my handles and stuff, because, it's great when people, not just a follow, but, like, I love hearing what people think about. We've had lots of people reach out and be like, oh, like, the Whitney concert was awesome. And I'm like, I love that. Like, again, it's like breaking down the wall of accessibility. Like, if people are enjoying the art I create, I want to know. I want people to tell me. So yeah, I would love to hear from people who love who love music we're creating, or future collaborators, or any of it. It's it just helps make our community smaller. So always happy to hear from folks.
Absolutely. Well, I wanted to, in closing, the last thing I wanted to ask you, I wanted to loop back around to something that you said a few minutes ago about Whitney. You said she raised us. When you said that, another Whitney moment that I thought of was when she collaborated with Mariah Carey on the Prince of Egypt soundtrack.
Yep.
So this wasn't some just kiddie glockenspiel music. These two women were
Yes.
up there singing to us,
Yeah.
at least to me as a child at that point. Even
Yeah.
beyond Whitney, I think about the television show, the kids' television show, All That would have music
Yeah.
at the end. You have folks like Deborah Cox, the Canadian Deborah Cox,
Yeah.
singing full voice at us. I feel like, you know, my generation, our generation, we were raised with these pop acts that are
Yes.
showing us something, just some vocal artistry that isn't necessarily present in today's pop music scene. And nothing against today's pop music
Yeah.
scene, but it feels different. And I won't say that it's a
Yeah.
level of
It
talent
is.
as much as it's just maybe a level of approach. The top 40 artists today aren't really
Yeah.
just belting, couldn't belt in the way that Mariah has, the way that Whitney
Yeah.
did, all of these people. All of that
Yeah.
to ask, I wonder if you can if you connect sort of that reality to the work that you're doing, even beyond classical. How do you think your work can have an impact on just the broader conception of music to sort of bring back this, I hate to use the word excellence, but to bring back this excellence,
Yeah.
quote unquote, that we were always used to growing up, thanks to these folks, these women who raised us, as you said.
Yeah, man, I mean, it's a really, really great question. And I do think about that. I mean, I think one of the angles I think about as far as like the demonstrating excellence, really, if we distill it down to that, like, even just watching a full orchestra or symphony on stage, that operationally there's so much focus and talent isn't really the right word to use. It's not encompassing enough, but there's so much focus and skill and it's a really, really, really you can't summarize that unless you see it and you see the work that goes into it and the intricacy, right? And so I think that's kind of a mirror for thinking about like literally what you just mentioned as far as the artists of our next generation who are thinking about doing this and what they bring and how they hone their craft. And I think that there's room for all of it. I think like even if the aesthetic of what a new generation brings is kind of like less to the tops and the bottoms in the way that like, Whitney or Mariah or whoever might have been, right? I think there's still room to really emphasize just craft, right? And real hard work in that craft. And I think so long as we continue to do that, I think we'll be okay because that's also, to be honest, that's what live music needs, right? I mean, that's a whole other thing we could unpack, but like the other part of this, as far as starting Pops of Color, was just looking at thinking about all of this music that we listen to on the radio or we listen to in repeat now that we don't get to do live. We don't get to hear live anymore, right? Or it's certainly not in this medium with like multiple instrumentalists playing along with it. So that's my hope, is that this also maintains and sort of forces a level of creative integrity and that will inspire people to, you never know, right? I hope young people come to our concerts and not just only think about what it feels like to be in a studio, but think about what it might feel like to write or to orchestrate, especially right on that. Those are crafts that, the more things get put into Logic or Pro Tools or I mean, it's like it's all like recording is important, but it's also we are descendants of some major generational the generations before us, immediately preceding us, they knew how to do live music,
Mhm.
right? And we see it in everything, right? It's like even as far as our unions and I going back to Broadway, our pits are half the sizes, if that they used to be, right? And so it's I think it's important for us to emphasize that there's a quality in that type of music and that sort of magnitude that you can only get if you lean in and you love the power of like live music of that size. So I hope that helps to maintain that artistic integrity as well. I really do.
That's the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra offering their take on The Greatest Love of All, a Whitney Houston classic, to say the very least. If you want to check out that entire performance or that entire album, there's a link to the recording in the description of this opus. Incredible thanks once again to Sean for joining me. Hope you'll take the time to learn more about the Pops of Color Orchestra and to see if you can catch an upcoming show. Be sure to also keep an eye on Sean's general calendar to see if you can catch him on Broadway if you find yourself in New York. And if you're lucky enough to be living north of the U.S. border right now, keep an eye out for his Toronto activities. Definitely a standout conductor in the field right now, creating greater relevance for the Western Symphonic Orchestra. So again, today's Trilloquy is themed around relevance, and more importantly, what's not relevant. I want to shout out my friend and colleague, Lady Jess, who's been preaching the gospel of relevance for years now, and she's also been on the Trilloquy podcast. If you want to go back, I think all the way to season 1 to hear what she had to say back then. It's easy for us to think of our all-black programming or our orchestras that showcase marginalized composers as hitting those respective communities, being relevant to those communities that we're highlighting artistically. But as we continue to see, that's just not always the case. It's often seldom the case. One of the biggest challenges with some of the work that I do has been this idea of orchestral music plucking people out of their communities and creating a bigger rift between what's relevant and what's not, placing these folks in communities that aren't their own. I'll use myself as an example. Growing up in Memphis, as I've talked about here before, I was surrounded by blues and jazz and hip hop. Shout out to 3-6 Mafia. There was just no avoiding any of that music. Now, that on top of church music, in retrospect, really gave me everything I would have needed to have a solid footing as an aspiring professional musician. But that's, of course, not quite how it all went down. I joined the middle school band. I learned to play the bassoon and quickly found myself outside of what I'd consider my community or my communities, certainly the music that defines those communities. The further I drifted from the cultural centerpieces of my upbringing, the less relevant my work to folks in those communities became. That's just a matter of fact. Now, this isn't to say that there aren't Black folks out there that don't love orchestral music. I love orchestral music. There are lots of people of color who go to concerts and play in orchestras. But broadly speaking, just when you count everything up, it's just not really the case. And maybe that's where I should pause. So we consider orchestral music, whether it's Whitney Houston or whether it's who are my W composers, Eric Whitacre or Weber or whoever. Is it all just inherently relevant, or is there an inherent pathway toward relevance with this music? Is this how we connect to communities, or is there a deeper relevance that musicians and art institutions can bring forward in efforts to broaden audiences? My personal thought is that relevance for classical music has to come in the form of multidisciplinary presentation. So if you think about movie music concerts or video game music concerts, they seem to do just fine. And even if it's not multidisciplinary, concerts that highlight specific cultures or perspectives are often very well sold. I remember when I was playing with the Knoxville Symphony, the Martin Luther King Jr. concert every year was always crowded, and it was a free concert that took place kind of during the day, like one of those awkward 4 p.m. or 5 p.m. concerts. To me, I think it's obvious that was just relevant to those people. Thinking about Sean again and Broadway, shows like The Lion King have been going on forever, not to mention some of those more classic Broadway shows like Phantom of the Opera or Cats. All of this, simply to say and to explore and inspire you to continue to think about what it means to actually be relevant to broader sets of audiences within the framework of what we call classical music. What makes a movie a must-see for you? What has you reaching in your pocket for a $50 box of popcorn? And to give take out 2.5 hours of your day to go watch a film. What makes you reach into your pocket to spend $100 or more, maybe even $1,000 if you're talking about somebody like Beyonce to go to that sort of concert? What's behind that for you? What makes it relevant? As I transition into slightly new work, I'm thinking about relevance as it relates to social justice. I want to work with composers who understand how their artistry can connect with community organizing or political activism. I want to see the unkept promises of America to Americans become realized. That if training in classical music is what I got, which it is, that's the tool that I have to use. As shout out to Lacolian, as he used to say in our lessons, you got to dance with the date that brung you. He was talking about reeds, but but I think you can apply that to just about anything. And again, please don't assume that something is relevant just because it's talked about a lot or shines a light on the marginal quote unquote excellence that exists within a community. And you see, that's also a part of this issue. When we start calling things excellent as a means of identifying it as being different than something else or more elevated than something else, you're already marginalizing yourself. But I think that's a bigger, broader conversation, the problematic nature of what we call Black excellence. Anyway, I'll close with a clip from a Q&A where Wynton Marsalis, the famous trumpeter and composer, jazz musician, he speaks on relevance. Take a quick listen here.
The first thing is be relevant to yourself. That's number one. The first step on the road to being relevant is be relevant to yourself. Establish what you're interested in doing and what means what. The meaning of things is very important to whether you're relevant or not. So I'll just ask you a question. I'll go back in history. Bach at one point was reduced from a music teacher to a math teacher. In his system, he taught music, and then he wrote the St. Matthew's Passion, and because the music was so great, he was reduced. We don't want you teaching music anymore. So at the end of his life, he's the greatest musician in Western music. He receives a demotion. Was he relevant?
And I want to shout out my friend Caesar for putting that clip on my radar. I mean, there's nothing really I can say against what he was saying there. Be relevant to yourself. I guess that'll do it for today. Thanks as always for continuing to support this project. I'll thank y'all in advance for the congratulations that are going to come my way with a bit of news that's going to start getting out there later this week as I'm recording this, talking about my next professional venture. But in the meantime, keep seeking and enjoy the ride. It's challenging out there right now. But that doesn't mean that we have to fight with a frown on our faces. Oppressive forces can take just about everything from us. They can take our very lives, but that doesn't mean we have to let them have our joy. So again, let's enjoy the ride that we're this roller coaster that we're on right now, to freedom, to resistance, to change. Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. Talk to y'all again soon.